Because of the success of the original I Know What You Did Last Summer, within just a year they were already working on a franchise. Horror movie executives, as we know, they love a good franchise. If they can make 10 films, they're going to do it every time. Especially when you have a long and catchy title like I Know What You Did Last Summer. Imagine if you added one word to that and you made it, I Still Know What You Did Last Summer. Sounds scarier, right? So I Still Know What You Did Last Summer takes place exactly a year after the original on the 4th of July again. The whole gang is back together. You got Jennifer Love Hewitt as Julie, Freddie Prinze Jr. as Ray, you have Brandy playing her roommate, a star-studded cast for the 90s. A bunch of up-and-coming talent, just like the first film. I really miss this era of horror when you had actual known and named actors and actresses in horror films. As I just said, we have Jennifer Love Hewitt back again as the lead Julie. She's off living at college in this one, trying to overcome the trauma of the events of what Ben Willis did, his killing spree, seeing him everywhere, dream sequences. And because she's in this, I need to point out, we use that term scream queen pretty loosely. She might be the best embodiment of a scream queen. Jennifer Love Hewitt has to have one of the best screams in horror movie history. But yeah, she's off at college with her roommate Brandy, and they enter themselves into this radio contest giveaway, and they win tickets to this resort in Jamaica.
96.7 radio.
Oh my God! Oh, yes.
Just one magic.
Yes.
Oh, wait, quick, getaway.
And that's the setup to this. They're going to go away to this tropical resort, and they're basically going to get picked off one by one. It's very much like And Then There Were None. And I have to start off by saying immediately, I am an absolute sucker for that atmospheric horror. I love whenever you put a bunch of protagonists in an area and they're just getting picked off one by one. There's nowhere to run. One way in, one way out, only by boat. They're in the middle of a tropical storm. I just love that atmosphere. Do they actualize on it perfectly? Not really. I think there's a lot more this movie could do. The atmosphere of it all, I'm a huge fan of that setup. And whenever you get a bunch of characters in a tight-knit area like that, I'm immediately on board. And I think it's an awesome area for a slasher. I have kind of a weird relationship with this sequel whenever I go back through this series and watch these films. Because on one hand, I always end up enjoying this sequel. But on the other hand, I kind of find it to be painfully average, like very forgettable. Not in the bad way, as I said, there's definitely worse films. I just never really remember what this movie's about and what's going on until I'm in the middle of it. I always remember the centric point and the twist and all of the main things, but how we get there, the stuff leading up to it, I always forget. So take that for what you will. It must not be too memorable in the beginning, mainly because of pacing, as I'll get into. A perfect word to describe this film, and I use this a lot during the review of the first film as well, is generic. There's a lot of tropes in this film. I mean, this movie opens up with a dream sequence, so you kind of know what you're going to get into from the opening scene. And there's just a lot of tropes that follow. A ton of those dream sequences, a ton of jump scares, a lot of twists that are fairly predictable, especially if you go back to 90s horror. It's kind of a cookie cutter example of when people were starting to make fun of horror films and how they said they had no plot and they were just lazy. I mean, think of the premise, just getting a radio giveaway to get tickets to the Caribbean for an all-inclusive resort to set up these killings. I love the atmosphere, but it's completely lazy. I mean, that is the most generic setup for a premise ever. And then it's the 1-year anniversary, exact same as the first. They must love 1-year anniversaries in this franchise. And it's also structured kind of strange for a slasher because this movie's paced really slow. The characters in the movie don't even know anything's going on at this resort for the first hour, which is an incredibly long time in a slasher film that goes on for only 90 minutes. For the first hour of the film, for characters to not even be aware there's a killer on the island, that tells you how this movie is paced. It takes quite a bit of time before you actually get to this island. I think you can bypass it though, because you have Julie as the lead, played by Jennifer Love Hewitt, who's pretty charismatic in this role because she just has such a warm personality on screen. I don't know if it's her acting, it's her real personality showing through on screen. I really don't know what it is, but there's kind of a vibrance to her character that makes everything she's going through way more sympathetic and way more believable, even though it is kind of hammed up in the way she's acting in all of these characters, much like the first film. But there's just something about her on-screen personality I've always found to be warm. That's the word I would use. So she's a very likable and empathetic protagonist, which I think helps you bridge that point up into the island where there is kills. And for a sequel, it's kind of the perfect example of what the 90s era of slashers were. As like most of the films in the 90s, the kills, pretty forgettable, very tame. A lot of off-screen stuff, nothing incredibly brutal, not a lot of gore. The entire 90s era, as I said, was very light in that regard. That's something that makes these films so campy. So with that, I would say the kills in this movie are just meh, completely average. They almost all take place off-screen. Much like the first film, you have one guy in a slicker coat with a hook going around picking people off one by one. They're at this resort, 10 people are trapped, And much like the first film, it is just ridiculous and asinine. I mean, it's one guy with a hook. Just gang up and beat his ass. Why are we running, isolating one by one and hiding? Beat his ass and get off the island, man. But it's a horror film. I get it. I digress. You gotta have some stupid characters, especially in the 90s era. That's what makes these movies so fun and so campy. But whenever I come back to this one in particular, I'm always left thinking that what makes it sort of memorable after watching it is the characters, for good or bad. Mostly bad, to be honest, because this movie has some of the most cartoony cast of characters in a horror film, especially a horror sequel franchise. Starting off with Jack Black's character, I gotta be the one to say it. I've said this in a couple of other reviews. He was in a movie. I don't understand how this guy got famous for acting. I have never had a liking to this guy's characters. I don't enjoy the way he acts. His brand of comedy is not for me. He plays the most ridiculously annoying, possibly the worst character in horror movie history in this weird stoner with dreads on this island. He also has quite possibly the worst Jamaican accent ever going in this. Yeah, I mean, like everything about his performance, top 10, definitely Mount Rushmore of horror worst characters ever put in the movie. He's not funny. He's out of place. He's an absolute cartoon character. All he does is go around telling smoking pot jokes. His death scene is an absolute cartoon.
What are you doing? No, seriously, don't do that!
People who have seen this movie, this is usually the legacy of the film, is that he is in this movie and gets killed because his character is just laughably terrible. Maybe great to some. I just think it's awful. And then you have the character of Tyrell, who's Brandy's boyfriend, who she brings to this island. And this character has absolutely no purpose other than being a corn dog who exists to try to get laid every scene, but also gets cock blocked in every single scene he's in, which is kind of an on-running bit of this film, but again, very cartoony for the type of serious movie they're trying to portray. Or the trope of the overly creepy greeter at the hotel front desk who's constantly making weird faces and saying cryptic things for no reason other than to be a forced red herring.
I want off this island.
That's not possible.
You'd be lucky to survive acting like that. Why are you saying that to the guests, man? And that's another thing about this film. Unless you're really brand new to horror, there's a couple of red herrings, about 2 or 3 of them that are just really forced. If this is your first slasher, maybe they catch you off guard, but much like the first one, you're trying to figure out who the killer is. They're presenting to you a couple of red herring characters to make you think that might be the killer, but it's very obvious in this one. Even going back and watching this, I haven't seen this one in years. I knew immediately when they showed that's not the killer. Like, I mean, that's not done well. But something I've always thought makes this franchise kind of interesting is it has a killer that has a really solid motive. He was ran over, he survived, he said, fuck these kids, he's trying to go kill them. So it makes sense that this guy is pissed off and he's made a vendetta his entire life to just kill this entire cast of friends. They tried to kill him and leave him for dead. That's very interesting in horror movie slashers. You don't usually have a killer with any incentive. They're just an absolute deranged psychopath, which this guy is, obviously. He's running around and gutting people with a fish hook, but he does kind of have a reason. They tossed him in the water and left him for dead. I mean, fuck you. I'm going to kill you as well. I've also always thought the major reveal twist of this movie is a lot more predictable than the first film. Like I said, I always kind of forget it until I come back to it. But about 20 or 30 minutes into this movie, they give you a crucial piece of information you can use to solve this mystery. And I always catch on to it again immediately because of what happens in the first film. I find this movie to be pretty predictable when it comes to the twist as well. And just like I said in my review of the first one, this movie might have the single dumbest very final scene before the credits in the history of cinema, because you have no continuity whatsoever. You have a character who is clearly killed about 5 minutes earlier, coming back on the other side of Earth for the sake of a jump scare that closed this off as if there was more movies in this franchise. It's probably the single dumbest, most forced horror movie trope ending in the history of movies. I always think that whenever I watch this, but at the same time, it kind of makes me laugh because it's that bad. So overall, guys, it probably sounds like I'm being a lot harder on this movie than I meant to be. I still do enjoy this movie as a stupid, lowbrow slasher campy horror film. Definitely doesn't have as good of a plot and mystery and twist as the first movie, but I still think it has a pretty cool final girl in Julie, played by Jennifer Love Hewitt. Some of the best screams in horror history. And if you're a big fan of atmospheric horror, where everybody's trapped in one spot at this resort where it's pouring down rain, they're soaking wet, you just have people getting picked off one by one, this one could be for you. Definitely not one of my favorites in the genre, but I do enjoy it whenever I watch it. I think it's a good watch if you have nothing else to do. So if you guys have seen this one or the first one, comment down below, let me know what you think of this franchise. As always, if you haven't subscribed yet, join me down below. I do it all on this channel. Peace.